I recently moved into a house that is backed up to woods. The woods are thick with birch and beech and pine. Miles of wooded nothingness, colored with browns and greens, fall-time reds and springtime yellows. But the forest to me seems only gray, like a forgotten tombstone from centuries past. The woods are silent, as if devoid of life. In the night, its gray bones, when bathed in moonlight, appear like prison bars caging something in. Something that lurks within the deep blackness. Something sinister. The woods, though, are not absent of wildlife. There are deer, and despite their presence, bring no noise but the rustling of leaves. This is not a home I chose, but rather inherited. Gifted from a grandfather I barely knew. My father's father. He'd left when my father was just a boy, and remained in his life through letters, and not much more. I was next on the inheritance list after my father passed, so here I am, living in a home that I might as well have inherited from a stranger. The house itself is rustic, wooden, and modern, if that makes any sense. Modern in a sort of angular way, with large windows and minimalist wide-open spaces. The house isn't new, though. It's over 50 years old. There's a sizable deck that I had initially thought would be a place I'd spend a great deal of time, reading books, drinking coffee, and letting my worries drift away as I listened to the woodland sounds. But the woods are the reason I don't go back there anymore. My coffee was warm in my hand as I stood on the deck one morning, not long after moving in. There was a light fog out. It was quiet. At the edge of the woods, a deer appeared, where it stood without crossing into the open. It stayed there looking at me. This went on for several minutes, then the deer turned and disappeared back into the foggy forest. It was odd, but not terribly so. That is, not until another morning, when the deer appeared again and did the same thing. Standing at the edge, staring, not taking a single step outside the woods. Perhaps I'd spooked it, I thought, and went indoors, where I watched from behind the glass door. But still, the deer stared at me. I moved to the bedroom, where the blinds were closed, and carefully lifted one a touch. And to my surprise, the deer had shifted itself so that it could continue to watch me. There was no hiding from this deer, it seemed. As I looked out at him, I began to feel very uncomfortable, as if I were staring into the eyes of something more than animal. The deer turned and disappeared into the woods. Each morning following, the deer would be there at the edge of the woods, watching. "You can come out of there," I said to it. I had an idea and went inside, grabbed a handful of grapes from the fridge, and tossed them into the yard. The deer's gaze never left me. It's not polite to stare, you know. For several more minutes, the deer watched me, then turned and left without touching the offering. Later that day, I visited a hardware store, went up to the register and asked the clerk, "Do you sell any deer feeders?" The clerk looked at me a moment, cocked his head, and asked, "What do you want that for?" The answer was obvious, I thought. To feed deer? "Do you have deer in your yard?" "Well, kind of. There's one that keeps coming right up to the yard, but never leaves the woods." The clerk was silent a moment, then asked, "Where do you live?" "Why does that matter?" The clerk narrowed his eyes, then exhaled and smiled. "Sorry. We don't have any deer feeders." That night, after having just finished dinner, I stepped outside with a drink in hand, hoping to gaze at the stars and listen to hooting owls. There, of course, were no hooting owls when I stepped outside. And because of clouds, no stars either. I sighed and took a sip of my drink, looked towards the woods, and noticed two glowing eyes. The deer. This was the first time I'd seen the deer at night. I stepped to the end of the deck and yelled, "What do you want?" The deer did not budge. I set my drink down and descended the stairs and into the yard. Still, the deer did not move. I stepped closer towards the deer. "I'm getting pretty sick of..." I paused. There were more eyes. More deer. About 6 total, standing side by side in the woods, staring at me. I slowly backed up, returned to the house, and locked the door. Deer don't open doors, I know, but something just wasn't right. Locking up provided some semblance of safety. I stood at the window for 15 more minutes before they finally left. The next day, I went back to the hardware store, which sells guns as well, to buy a rifle. I'd settled on a Remington 783 hunting rifle. Before handing me the gun, the clerk asked, "Do you plan on using it locally?" "I don't know." "Hunting ain't allowed here." I looked up from the glass display case. "What? Never?" The clerk shook his head. "Never." "Then why do you sell hunting rifles?" "Our customers don't hunt locally." I sighed. "What's the big deal?" The clerk stared at me a moment, then leaned forward. "You're thinking of shooting the deer, aren't you?" "No." "Then what?" "I don't know. I want it, just in case." The clerk straightened back up, turned around, and returned the Remington to the rack. "I can't sell you this gun." "Hey, wait. Why not?" "You might misuse it." I was growing irritated. "That's ridiculous. Just sell me the gun." He stepped from behind the counter and held his hand toward the door. "We're closed now. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave." I looked at my watch. "It's only noon." "We close at noon today." I coughed a frustrated laugh. "You gotta be fucking with me." The clerk was straight-faced, his hand still held toward the exit. I rolled my eyes and walked to the door. The clerk followed, and as I exited, he warned, "Leave the deer alone." He locked the door and flipped the sign in the window to closed. I went home that day and waited, checking the back window every hour, and when night came, the deer had returned. I grabbed a flashlight and a golf club and stepped outside and into the yard. "Go away!" I yelled and whacked the ground with the club. The deer didn't move. "You heard me! Get out of here!" Again, I hit the ground with the club. I shined the light along the edge of the woods and could see all 6 deer. "Go!" Whack. No response. I flung the club toward the deer, and it collided with a nearby tree. The deer did not flinch. "What the fuck?" I muttered under my breath. Deer are infamously jumpy creatures, and here was 6 of them, not reacting at all to me chucking a golf club at them. I stood in the yard, heart racing, watching them watch me. Then slowly and all together, they turned and began to walk away. I kept the flashlight's beam on them, and as they moved, it illuminated a 7th deer, but one that was much larger than the others. They trotted past it, and I lifted the beam from this larger deer's legs to its torso, and then finally settled on its head. "Fuck!" I gasped and stumbled backward, fumbling the flashlight from my hands. The deer had a human face. I quickly reached for the light and pointed it back toward the dark woods, and the beam fell on the creature again, who had now stepped closer toward the edge of the woods. He glared at me from large, human eyes, set into a fleshed, emotionless face. Atop his head were antlers, and his body was precisely that of a deer. He took another slow step towards me without making a sound. Not a breath or even a crunch of leaves. So quiet, it was as if he were floating. I spun around and sprinted through the yard and up the stairs, across the deck and into the house. I slammed the door, locked it, turned off the lights, and ran to the bedroom window, where I fearfully peeked through a crack in the blinds. The creature stepped to the edge of the woods. Then, to my utter surprise, continued into the yard. Immediately, I became filled with dread. This thing had left the woods and was walking toward my house. I held my breath and watched as the creature came so close that I lost sight of it beneath the deck. I quickly shifted and searched for the creature. And just before I was about to turn and scramble to another room, I saw the creature's antlers. It was ascending the steps up to the deck, and as it climbed, its head was turned in my direction, eyes glaring at me. I dropped to the floor and hid beneath the window, then shuffled across the floor and out of the room. I hurried into the kitchen, grabbed my keys, and as I ran through the living room, there he was, standing at the glass door, looking in at me. I did not stop. I ran out the front door, jumped in my car, and left town. I have not returned since.